Good evening. My name is Carol Allman Morton, and I'm OLLI's Executive Director. I'm so glad to welcome you tonight. As we begin with gratitude and humility, we acknowledge that those of us in the Berkshires are learning, speaking, and gathering on the ancestral homelands of the Mohican people, who are the indigenous peoples of this land. Despite tremendous hardship in being forced from here, today their community resides in Wisconsin and is known as the Stockbridge-Munsee community. We pay honor and respect to their ancestors past and present as we commit to building a more inclusive and equitable space for all. I have just a few short announcements and then we'll get started. To learn more about programming at OLLI at BCC, you can check out our website, berkshireolli.org, and you can see our calendar at that address/events. Some highlights include March workshops on organization, singing, and writing, and registration is now open for a free and open to the public talk with Sarah Vowell on April 8th on her book Lafayette in the Mostly United States, which will kick off an 18-month series of programs on the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution and the 200th anniversary of Lafayette's visit to the Berkshires. We have 3 distinguished speaker lectures in March, including Professor Joel Wolfe from UMass Amherst on the history of football on March 3rd on Zoom, Professor James Ketterer from Bard College on Jazz Diplomacy, America's Conversation with the World on March 11th in person at BCC, and Austin Serrett, the William Nelson Cromwell Professor of Jurisprudence and Political Science at Amherst College, for a lecture and conversation on the future of democracy, which will be March 18th on Zoom. And if you're planning ahead, our spring semester of classes begins on March 31st, and our spring open house will be March 4th at 10 a.m. Tonight, we welcome James Brooke. Jim is a foreign correspondent who draws on 14 years living and working in Kyiv and Moscow as a foreign correspondent for the New York Times, the Voice of America, Bloomberg, and several business news outlets. Jim currently writes twice a week on Russia-Ukraine for the New York Sun. I also want to thank John Dixon, who will be moderating the questions and answers when we get to that point in the talk. John served 26 years in the U.S. Foreign Service and is the author of History Shock, Where History Collides with Foreign Relations. As we go along, please put your questions in the chat. You can type them anytime so you don't forget, but we'll hold them until after Jim's talk, and then John and Jim will make their way through as many as we can get to. So welcome, James Brooke. Thank you.
Hi. And I think John is going to. John, that's the intro, right? Yeah.
All yours.
Good, great. Well, thanks for having me. It's great to be back. And I thought since this is, I don't know, my 3rd or 4th time before the group, it might be therapeutic to start off with what I got wrong. And I underestimated Vladimir Putin's tenacity. As we approach the 3rd year anniversary of the war, which will be February 22, there are 1 million dead and wounded, largely on the Russian side. So he has not used various exit ramps available to him. He's determined to keep pushing ahead, whether he kills another 100, 200,000. So we are looking at the biggest war that Europe has seen since 1945. Our generation remembers the Balkan Wars in the 1980s, 90s. That was 100,000 dead and wounded. So what we're seeing in Ukraine over the last 3 years is 10 times that amount. So, and I think it's important to look at the numbers. The latest figure is that 841,000 Russian soldiers have been killed or wounded, probably about a third of those are killed. That is, and in the last month, there were 48,000 killed and wounded. That is the equivalent of about half the number, the 48,000 that were killed during a decade in Afghanistan. And to date, 16 times the number of the Soviet soldiers killed in Afghanistan, killed and wounded, 16 times have been killed in Ukraine in the last 3 years. So it's a huge death toll. Putin keeps things in place with a very ferocious censorship and once again, this tenacious will to keep plodding ahead. And don't forget, the Soviet Union had double the population of Russia today. The U.S. and Russia and U.S. and Soviet Union are about the same, around 288 million, say in 1990. Russia's down to 144 million. So this is taking almost a million men as dead and wounded off the table is huge for Russia. And when the censorship is lifted, it'll be something that Putin will have to deal with. I'm not so sure he can survive that. Let's look at the material losses. Once again, using Afghanistan as the yardstick, in 3 years, the Russians have lost 16 times the number of armored personnel carriers, 51 times the number of artillery systems, and 67 times the number of tanks. Now, by now, your eyes are glazing over. 10,000 tanks the Russians have lost, destroyed, severely damaged, or captured in Ukraine. 10,000 tanks, well, what is that? Well, add up the number of tanks in the British Army, the French Army, the German Army, and the Italian Army, and you come up with about 900. Okay, so in Ukraine, Russia has lost 10 times the number of tanks that the main NATO armies have in Europe. That was the post-Cold War peace dividend where everyone let their tanks go to rust and dismantle their tank battalions. And, the Great British Army has 213 tanks, largely chieftains. The German Army has 295, largely leopards. So it's basically Russia has burned through the Cold War stocks in the last 3 years. When you read about a T-54 tank, it's very simple. That tank was designed and built in 1954, which we may think was just the other day, but actually it's 71 years ago. So T-54, T-62s, Russia is gone very deeply into their reserves, and British intelligence has shown aerial photos of these outdoor patios that once were covered with armored personnel carriers and tanks. They're gone. And the Russian troops are often now entering battle on pickup trucks or literally on Chinese-made golf carts. And they don't fare terribly well. So, but Putin thinks he's winning and he's marching ahead. If you look around the clock, last 3 years, it's been a huge geostrategic defeat for Russia, starting with the Baltics after 50 years, in the case of Sweden, 200 years. Sweden and Finland have joined NATO. The Baltic Sea is now a NATO sea, or a NATO lake, one might call it. And this is why you've been reading about all this hybrid warfare of ships dragging their anchors and cutting communication and energy cables and pipelines across the Baltic. The Washington Post had what I think was a very naive story saying these are all accidents. It just came out a week ago. They neglected to mention that this Friday, in 3 days, the Baltic countries, thanks to 15 years and 1.7 billion euros investment, the Baltic countries, the first time since 1945, will leave the Russian electricity grid and join the Finland to Poland electricity grid. So, surprise, surprise, a ship dragged its anchor and cut the electricity cable between Finland and Estonia, a few weeks ago. So, continuing around the clock, the Baltics, well, the Scandinavian countries are now solidly NATO. Poland, which most Americans know not much about, Poland is building the largest land army in NATO. So Poland is looking towards building up a 1 million-man army of its own. Romania is building the largest NATO base, which will be larger than Ramstein, our base in Western Germany. That's on the military side. On the economic side, thanks to Putin's invasion of Ukraine, Russia has lost the top market for its top export, which is pipeline gas to Europe. So the as a result, Gazprom, which when I lived in Moscow, they were touting it as Russia's first trillion-dollar company. Gazprom is laying off 40% of the personnel in its headquarters. And last year, for the first time in 20 years, Gazprom suffered a loss, profit loss. Gazprom, as you know, is the export monopoly for gas for Russia. So the US has supplanted Russia as the number one supplier of LNG. And when you watch over coming days, when President Trump threatens and maybe implements tariffs on EU for, quote, unfair trading and having a huge deficit, the Europeans will probably come back and say, we will buy your LNG. You will be our favored, we will get the LNG from New Orleans, from the Gulf of America. They might even say that to make the president feel comfy. The pipeline gas, Norway has supplanted, replaced Russia as the number one source of pipeline gas to Europe, which is another reason why Russian spy ships are patrolling the Norwegian waters, looking for potential disruption possibilities there. Going back to my days when I was the Bloomberg bureau chief in Moscow, I banked at Citibank. My paycheck went into Citibank. Citibank has sold out their operations in Russia. Goldman Sachs just sold out their operations in Russia. Rafferson has just sold out their operations. ING, all at huge pennies on the dollar. You have the Danish brewer Baltica sold pennies on the dollar to the nephew of Ramzan Kadyrov, the head of Chechnya. Now, Putin is giving these fire sale sales to his political supporters, but frankly, if you're trying to develop a country, you'd prefer to have smart capital versus dumb capital. Would you rather have the Danes running your breweries or the nephew of a chieftain of Chechnya? So it will take decades to rebuild Western investor confidence in Russia. When I lived in Moscow, which was only 10 years ago, there was this odd group. They were the French bondholders, and they'd come and kind of demonstrate because they didn't like the deal that the French government had cut with the Russian government to pay them pennies on the dollar for their bonds. They were holding probably copies, but they had the originals. Tsarist bonds for building railroads in Russia in 1914. 100 years later, their grandchildren and great-grandchildren were saying, give us the money. So when people have had their assets stolen, they tend not to forget. Short term, Putin's won maybe a little bit on this, but long term, Russia is losing big on this. And with this divestment, Russia really is becoming a Chinese economic colony where they supply iron ore and timber and water and gas and oil, and they buy goods from China. So there's a real economic dependency. You probably have heard the phrase stagflation. That is what you will see in Russia this year. The stag part comes from stagnation. The economy might grow by 1.5%. The inflation is about officially 10%, probably really 20%. So you have stagflation. It's a stagnation. Here in the US, we may complain about interest rates. The Russian rates are 21%. That's their prime rate, 21%. And sensible economists predict that by the end of this year, 20% of Russian companies will be bankrupt. They may stagger along, but technically they'll be bankrupt. People have often been awed by the sovereign wealth fund, which is this wonderful multi-billion-dollar pillow that they assembled over 20 years of oil exports. Putin's chewed through half of his sovereign wealth fund to pay for the war. It's now down to $117 billion. Just a little point of comparison, mild and meek Norway, Russia's neighbor to the north, their sovereign wealth fund is 15 times larger. It's $1.7 trillion for a population of 5.5 million people. So the Russian sovereign wealth fund is not as impressive as it used to be, and it is dwindling at a steady rate. We see that Putin has lost a lot of prestige and influence. When I was there, his shtick was to make foreign heads of state wait. He made Queen Elizabeth wait 10 minutes for him. He showed up late deliberately. He made the Pope wait a similar amount of time. Um, I know for a fact he made Obama wait about 45 minutes at their summit in Los Cabos, Mexico. It was a G7 summit. So this is a way that Putin, and he made Angela Merkel wait for 4 hours. It's kind of the champion waiter for Putin. And this is something he would do to put other people on their back foot and to try to gate a little bit of sort of KGB negotiating edge. So where we are now, last time he was in China, he marched out for a bilateral photo session with the Chinese Premier Xi Jinping, and Xi Jinping stood off camera for about a minute, and Putin's kind of there fidgeting and checking his watch. So Putin now waits. In Kazakhstan, which is their southern neighbor, the most important neighbor in Central Asia, I remember when the president of Kazakhstan met Putin a few months ago, and the president of Kazakhstan, believe it or not, served in the Soviet foreign ministry, and obviously speaks fluent Russian, went to Moscow, the top Moscow schools. And when he addressed Putin, he talked to him in Kazakh, which you can imagine really pissed off the Russians. The former colonial is talking in the native language. So we just go around the clock. I mean, we saw they lost influence in the Azeri Armenia war. They were supposed to be the umpire, the peacemaker. They failed on that one. But more immediately, as they lost their client state, Assad in Syria, and Bashar al-Assad took refuge in Moscow. But Russia is probably in the process of losing their only warm water port, only port in the Mediterranean, Tartus, Syria, which is an important jumping off point for their operations in Africa. So, these are real losses. This isn't some sort of psychological geostrategy analysis. And they're also losing their air base in Syria. And in terms of losing face, probably for me, the biggest one is the fact that on August 6th, Ukrainian troops invaded Kursk, which is one of the oblasts, one of the regions in Russia. And I remember sending the headline to New York, and they said, no. Ukraine doesn't invade Russia. It's the other way around. Russia invades Ukraine. Well, in this case, Ukraine did invade Russia on August 6th. And surprise, surprise, in 2 days, Thursday will mark the 6-month anniversary. The Ukrainians are still there. They're controlling an area about half the size of Berkshire County, Massachusetts, actually a quarter of the size, 250 square miles. And in 6 months, the Russians have been unable to dislodge them. And they've lost literally tens of thousands of men trying to do it. If you know your history, Kursk was the site in the summer of 1943 of the largest tank battle in world history. It is a sacred, revered name for generations of Russian and Soviet school children. They all learn about the Battle of Kursk and how the Red Army tanks took on the the Nazi tanks and prevailed with huge losses on both sides. And it's a class. It is the battle. Well, when time came to defend Kursk, to once again repel the invaders from Kursk, Putin didn't see many hands raised. He could not get his own people to expel the invaders of the holy Russian land of Kursk. So what did he do? He imported about 12,000 North Korean mercenaries. And that was kind of like, it was a huge loss of face that he had to import soldiers to defend his own homeland. And B, they performed very poorly. An estimate is about a third of the North Koreans have been killed or wounded. Um, they did, and I know they don't like the comparison because Korea is a former colony of Japan, but they did these kind of bonsai charges where everything for the emperor and just were mowed down by the defending Ukrainians. And we're now in sort of a lull where the North Koreans have pulled back and the Ukrainian lines basically have not really changed at all. They're still inside Kursk 6 months later. So once again, we look at the geostrategic point of view, the military view, the economic view. Putin is doing terribly, but he's hanging in there. Okay, the second place where I erred was that I underestimated Europe. Many of us Americans, we tend to think that Europe was interested in Ukraine kind of as, jumping on board the American hobby horse, not really interested. There's that famous quote from Schwarzkopf during Desert Storm. I invite the French because someone's got to play the accordion. We make these kind of snotty remarks about the Europeans. The Europeans actually have stepped up to the plate. The U.S. has delivered $70 billion in aid. The Europeans have delivered 140 billion in economic and military aid to Ukraine, double the amount, despite the phony numbers that our president is putting out. They've put a lot of money. Now, why is the EU, the European nations, helping Ukraine? And it's not to be nice to Washington. 2 weeks ago in Davos, President Zelensky gave a pretty good hint. He estimated that his army, the Ukrainian army, is 880,000 men and women, many with battle experience. That means that the Ukrainian army is about equal to the total number of soldiers of Europe's 5 largest armies, Poland, France, Germany, Italy, and Britain. Okay, so the 5 largest NATO armies basically equal that of Ukraine. Now, as I said earlier, Poland is ramping up radically and spending 5% of its GDP on defense. But the bottom line is that Europe now sees Ukraine as a dike, as a barrier to stop the westward expansion of Russia. So in a nutshell, Europe is now scared of Russia, which was not the case 10 years ago. And to some degree, Europe has been galvanized. On the anecdotal level, Finland this year is opening 300 shooting ranges for its civilians. They have a sort of citizen army. And if you know your history, during the Winter War and the Continuation War in 1939-41, they performed quite well, and they drew huge losses from the Soviet army. Poland this year has instituted mandatory firearms training in all of its high schools. They don't use live weapons, they use a laser system. But basically, they're moving in the civil defense area. And the dialogue, the rhetoric, and I think what we've seen with the Trump administration is listen to what they say before they come to power. In case of Russia, it's not they're already in power. Just 2 days ago, Putin gave this interview to Russian state media where he basically was quite insulting about European countries. He said that when Master Trump asserts himself, they will wag their little tails for him. Uh, I consider that a pretty insulting image. But more seriously and dangerously, on Russian state TV, especially in their Sunday night talk shows, which have a mere 50 million viewers, they casually, routinely talk about nuking Warsaw, Berlin, Paris, London. So this is state TV. Um, and one popular host, Vladimir Sobolyov, technically the most popular, it's hard to gauge popularity because the entire media in Russia is controlled by the state. But he said Finland, Warsaw, the Baltics, Moldova, southern Finland, and Alaska, quote, should be returned to the Russian Empire. Uh, so this is the kind of dialogue. Now, don't worry about Alaska. You know, Alaska with Mount McKinley will stay where it is. But the other countries are pretty concerned about this. Um, so keep in mind that Europe is galvanized, and being 32 countries, whatever's in the EU, there will be debate, there will be outliers. Hungary and Slovakia are kind of carrying the water for Putin in Russia, in Europe. Surprise, surprise. Hungary and Slovakia are the two countries that most depend on pipeline gas, probably the last two that depend on pipeline gas from Russia. So they are economically dependent on Russia, and hence they try to throw the spanner in the works for renewing sanctions and sort of thing. But don't get distracted by them. I mean, look at what Macron is, the Germans, the French, the Italians. Giorgia Meloni is very tough on Russia. So where are we now? Newsflash: Russia is not winning, although Putin thinks they're winning, which is the huge problem. They've gone from controlling maybe 10% of Russia before the war started in seriously about 3 years ago. They went up to 27%. Now they're down to controlling 20%. And really, there's been there's been a stagnation, as you know, in the front lines for the last 18 months. Over the last 7 months, starting in July, the Russians launched a huge offensive, and they conquered 1,090 square miles, 1090 square miles of Ukraine. That sounds like, whoa, 1,000 square miles. That sounds like a lot. Well, keep in mind, Ukraine is 233,000 square miles. So Russia has conquered less than half of 1% since July. In this offensive, Russia lost 300,000 men killed and wounded, probably 1/3 killed, 2/3 seriously wounded. That really is a definition of a Pyrrhic victory, and that phrase goes back 2,500 years. It's not a place you want to be throwing away that kind of men and material. As I mentioned, the North Koreans have pulled back. The Ukrainians, being the David and the Goliaths, and the current phrase is asymmetric warfare. And they realize that they are the underdogs. So they have developed the world's best military drone capabilities. They have the world's only standalone drone force, about 3,000 men and women who are fighting using drones. We know about the drones on the battlefield. You can't stick your nose out of a trench without being spotted by a drone. They're as simple as just dropping grenades on drones and on trenches, to going straight into a quote safe house, flying in the window and blowing the place up, to taking out. These 10,000 tanks weren't destroyed just by accident. Artillery, this is a war where artillery is not as important as it used to be. Um, and But the thing to watch this year, Zelensky has set a goal of producing 30,000 long-range drones. Um, some of us got distracted last fall. This big debate, should we let Zelensky use these long-range weapons to hit targets inside Russia, yes or no? Long range meant 190 miles. The Ukrainians have built drones, which essentially are like a Piper or a Cessna, to go 600, 900 miles. The Ukrainians can send drones from near the border all the way up to the Ural Mountains. And the Russians, post World War II, moved a lot of their defense plants or set them up, gave themselves that kind of buffer zone. So the Ukrainians are sending in drones 600 miles. Just, I think it was Sunday night, they had a gas processing plant in Astrakhan, which is at the top of the Caspian. And you can see the videos, this thing burning up. In the last 2 weeks, Ukrainian drones have severely damaged 3 of the top 5 refineries in Western Russia. They blew up pumping stations on the Druzhba, friendship, pipeline, which is the world's longest pipeline. And that did 2 things. It sent a signal to Hungary and Slovakia that your oil supplies are not to be guaranteed. That pipeline's an oil pipeline. And equally important, it stopped loading of oil for export in Ust-Luga, which is the second largest oil exporting port for Russia in the Baltic. It accounts last year for about 20% of Russia's oil exports. So this stuff adds up. You take out 3 of the top 5 refineries in Western Russia, you blow up the pipeline, all this stuff can be rebuilt, but it's a nightmare for the Russians. There are 20 pumping stations on this pipeline. There are probably 15, 20 significant refineries in Western Russia. And these ones that were heavily damaged, had many of them been hit before. There's one that the Russians just gave up on. It was only like 5 miles east of occupied Ukraine, and that had been hit so many times they just decided to shutter it. This is adding up. Now, how much does Putin know? Not much. I mean, this is the guy who invaded Ukraine and thought that he could do it in 3 days. As you may recall, the initial troops had their dress uniforms in their backpacks so they could parade down the center of Kyiv. That was their kit in late February of 2022. So where are we now? Both sides, both men are pinning their hopes on manipulating President Trump. Now, Trump is a bit of a cipher. We know he's a deal maker. We know he's contractual. The Trump team in key posts has people who are hawks on Russia, starting with Secretary of State Marco Rubio, son of Cuban exiles. It's hard to find the son of Cuban exiles who would be soft on Russia. The National Security Advisor, Mike Waltz, is also a Russia hawk. And the man who's really starting to negotiate, he's going to Kyiv next week, is the retired Lieutenant General Keith Kellogg, who is being impartial, but the Russian press has blown up the fact that his daughter lives in Romania and she sends aid to Ukrainian military from Romania. So humanitarian aid. So on one hand, Trump wants a solution. He said he'd do it the first day. That was obviously undoable. Now he's saying it'll take 100 days, which brings us up to late April. Keep in mind that Trump does not want to do what he blames Biden for, which is losing Afghanistan. Although Trump kind of set the Afghan thing in motion, Afghanistan was lost on Biden's watch and was a real negative, obviously. And I happened to be in Ukraine when that happened, and the Russians, the Kremlin people, were telling Ukraine, "You're next. Look, your American friends let Afghanistan go down the tubes. You're next." Keep in mind that Trump, he likes to break the rules, but also he will walk away from negotiations if they're not going the way he likes. And remember all that time he wasted with Kim Jong-un, the leader of North Korea, the first and only American president to meet Kim Jong-un. He gave Kim Jong-un a lot of rope, and Kim Jong-un didn't give him a deal, and he walked away from it. I think when we're looking at a deal, the Poles, the Germans, the French, and the Brits are talking about stationing troops on what could be a DMZ. I think everyone understands that ceasefires are worthless. They're not worth the paper they're written on. Russia's violated so many ceasefires in their area they took in 2010 that no one takes a ceasefire seriously. We're talking about an armistice. We're talking about a Korean Peninsula style armistice, which there is no peace treaty between South and North Korea. South Korea does not recognize North Korea. North Korea does not recognize South Korea. There's the DMZ, the demilitarized zone, which stretches from one sea to the other. It's 150 miles. A DMZ in Ukraine would be trickier. It would be 4 times the length of the Korean DMZ. It'd be 600 miles. And the DMZ works because of the human tripwire, which is American soldiers who've been based for 70 years south of the DMZ. The king, grandfather, son, and grandson have all clearly understood that if you follow through on your promises to turn Seoul into a sea of fire, you will kill Americans and the US will come down like a ton of bricks on you. And they have very unhappy memories of really being bombed back to the Stone Age in the early 50s. So that only works. It doesn't work with UN blue hats from Cambodia or wherever. I like Cambodia, but you have to have countries with skin in the game. Obviously, Zelensky is very much lobbying for American troops. Trump has said no American troops. However, we could provide logistical support, aircraft, Hercules, continued supplying of intelligence to monitor any violations. And a wild card, if we think outside the box, could be Chinese troops. I think Trump is going to lean on China to exert their influence to get some sort of settlement. And I know the Europeans are quite uneasy with the first Asian troops on the European landmass, which are the North Koreans, but it could be a way to give some sort of guarantee. China is happy to see Russia weak because they get better deals. They get gas at a discount, they get oil at a discount, they get everything at a discount. China does not want to see Russia defeated. A defeated Russia means Russia splitting up and all sorts of countries coming off of the edges. Once again, Russia, China have a 2,700-mile undefended border. The Chinese believe they will not be stabbed in the back, which is true. And more importantly, the Russians believe they will not be stabbed in the back. So both countries want to maintain that relationship. So the Chinese might step forward as part of some grand plan, which Putin potentially, the big deal, art of the deal. So that's where we are now. China and Russia are very close. China is giving help to Russia. I think one problem is that that Putin believes he's winning. He's intoxicated by the fact that he's taken some forgettable villages and a couple of cities that he's flattened, and he thinks he's winning, which he's not. But when you think you're winning, you stick with it. Just to brush up my history, I researched the end of Adolf Hitler. Adolf Hitler only bit into that cyanide capsule when the Soviet troops were 500 yards away. And if you know the geography of Lenox, Massachusetts, 500 yards is a quarter mile. The distance from the monument, our Revolutionary War monument, and our church on the hill is half a mile. So the Soviet troops were almost knocking at his door. Now that is a different case, but keep in mind that Putin does think he's winning, and that doesn't make him terribly open to serious negotiations, and he may stick it out. And I think if you look at the European defense spending plans, where 4 countries have already met the Trump challenge of spending 4% of their 4% of GDP on defense. First time around, Trump harangued them about spending 2%. There was a lot of moaning and wailing, but now about 80% of NATO is meeting that 2% of GDP goal. Now, Trump has moved the goalpost to 5%, and Poland, Sweden, and the Baltics, actually probably 5 countries, have said they will do 5%. Now, the biggies are obviously Germany, France, Britain, but they all are talking about increasing defense spending. In fact, Rutte, who is the head of NATO, Mr. Mild-mannered Dutch former prime minister, political survivor, diplomatic, he addressed Europeans a couple of days ago and said, you got a choice. We got 3 choices: spend more on defense, move to New Zealand, or study Russian. So make your pick. I'm going to hang it up there, John, Carol, Judith, Catherine. I'm open to questions. John is our question monitor. So look forward to seeing what everyone has to say.
Well, thank you, Jim. We have a lot of questions and a lot on a lot of different areas that you've covered. One area you didn't cover that I just want to mention at the top, since you mentioned it at your top.
Here's my promotional mug here. Thank you. Thanks to my lovely wife.
And right behind me, I've got a Stand with Ukraine a poster I've had up for the last 3 years. I think you gave me.
Yeah, I printed them up.
But it was about 3 years ago. You and I did want to just say you got a lot right. Before it was about 3 years ago, almost to the day, that you talked about the invasion being almost certain, a couple of weeks away. Not that you had any inside information, but you were just reading the tea leaves. So and as you've done these talks over the, once a quarter, you do get a lot right. So you're not going to say that, but I'll say it for you. We've had a lot of questions on Putin, and a lot of questions on Trump, and a lot of questions on Ukraine and Zelensky. And I thought we could maybe organize them that way. Early on, let's focus on Putin. How does Putin survive? You talked about the numbers. Somebody said, what about these soldiers who are returning? And, is there pressure? You mentioned, is once censorship's lifted, do you see that happening? How does he come out of this safe phase?
A good question. I don't think that Putin can survive the lifting of censorship. Putin, by the way, is 72 years old, and he's got enough mojo to invade a few more countries. But, at some point, he's going to want to step back. And he has 2 secret sons, but they're only 5 and 8. So it's going to take them a while to become heir apparent. I think Putin, he has a real lock on things. He's very adept at appealing to strains of paranoia, imperialism that run through all Russians. Everyone's up against us. I remember one of the czars, I think Alexander II, said, Russia has 2 allies, its army and its navy. A big F you to the rest of the world. I think one thing I didn't quite compute was the Russian strategic because they're flat as a pancake and there are no mountains to hit the Urals, and the Nazis took advantage of that, they really want defensive space. They want a buffer space from southern Finland down to the Black Sea. And I think I never forget, I was covering the previous so-called election in Belarus, and the opposition candidate, a very savvy guy, used to be the deputy foreign minister, said, "I'm tired of being a buffer." And Belarus is a buffer. And the strategists in Russia, in the Kremlin, look at Ukraine as a buffer. And if you look at World War II, Ukrainians probably suffered the most in terms of the entire country was at one point occupied, chewed up. They formed a huge part of the Red Army. A lot of the fighting was done inside Ukraine, disproportionate amount. So Putin, to answer the question about where Putin, how does he survive? He's very good at adept at playing on these insecurities and these imperialist feelings, where for Russia to be an empire, for Russia to be a big cheese, really means a lot to people, many people in Russia, and they will put up with a lot of privation. So the stagflation problem, really, he'll survive that. I'm surprised there's not been more sort of rebellion in the ranks. I was just reading that a sergeant tied up a soldier and just tied him to a tree, and the man froze to death. I mean, this is kind of stuff that goes on. There's a video of two injured soldiers who'd been dragged out of their hospital and refused to go to the front line. They're being tasered by a sergeant. So the interpersonal relationships in the Russian army really haven't evolved much since 1914 or 1905. So I'm surprised there aren't, the problem we had in Vietnam, the fragging, the killing of officers, that has not really happened. There is concern about men coming back from the front being traumatized and committing crimes. Putin has filled the ranks. He's emptied the prison colonies. I think several prison colonies actually closed. There's just not enough clients. They've passed a law that if you are awaiting trial, you can skip the trial process and go straight to the front. Some men have taken that. If you owe big debts, you can absolve them by going to the front. The problem is, there's a very good chance that you end up dead. And Putin has, I think he's got $30,000 signing bonuses for soldiers. So he's run up the bill on trying to fill the ranks. And the latest gimmick is that I think the death benefit might be 100,000, but if the corpse is never found, they don't have to pay the 100,000. So a lot of Russian corpses are being left on the battlefield. It's pretty grim what's going on. I don't know if I went off the track, but
No, that was, and the irony is, as much as Putin wanted to weaken NATO or get this buffer state, it's just the opposite. Especially if you're going to put European troops as a buffer in Ukraine, this is what he did not want at all. And you've got NATO pushing up against the Russian border in the Baltics.
yeah.
Let me ask a little bit about Ukraine. We've got a number of questions about Ukraine and how Ukraine is faring, how Zelensky is faring. We hear about and we see, firings of ministers and replacing conflict between different ministers. They've postponed an election. What's your sense of what's going on in Ukraine in this?
Yeah, well, Ukraine's a democracy and messy as a result. I covered Zelensky's election, and he was one of 7 candidates. He was a popular guy, but he was a comedian. He was an actor to start out with. And he did okay in the first round and then beat the sitting president in the second round. So the sitting president lost and stepped down. There was no January 6th whining about counting the votes. And the election should have been last May. The country's been under martial law since February 22 of 22, when the real war started. Um, that has been brought up that there should be an election as part of a peace settlement. And I think, frankly, the Ukrainian government's open to that, but they want a real rock solid armistice that has teeth to it, not just security guarantees. Otherwise, it's just placating Putin, and no one seems to be questioning Putin's elections, which are fraudulent, obviously. Um, so I think the mood in Ukraine is war fatigue. The Russians misplayed their cards by, in the areas they went into, they killed, raped, murdered, tortured people. People in Ukraine know that. So for them, it's not an intellectual battle. It's a battle for personal and national survival. One option is to run, leave the country. The other option is to stay and fight. So for now, they are short of people, of soldiers. Um, so they are obviously under the pressure too. But I think Zelensky has risen to the challenge, and frankly, I think if he were given the chance, he might actually step down. There are proto candidacies out there. There's Klitschko. I used to live around the corner from Klitschko. He's the mayor of Kyiv. He's about 6'7" and has the reach, the longest reaches in the world. He's a former boxing champion, and along with his brother, younger brother. Off the record, his younger brother is a little smarter than he is, but they would be happy to. I think Klitschko, mayor of Kyiv, would be a candidate. Poroshenko, the former governor, might be a former president, might be a candidate. So there are candidates there. And Zelensky, if he's satisfied that Ukraine won't be gobbled up again by Russia, he might be happy just to give himself a vacation.
We have a number of questions, Jim, too, on Ukraine and their rare minerals and what role they might play in any negotiated settlement. Is this leverage that they could bring to the U.S. to get American support for more armaments or to get Russian support for a peace deal?
Well, I think it's especially appealing to our president, who's known as a contractual guy. Let's make a deal. Ukraine is almost the size of Texas. It is a treasure chest of minerals. A good chunk are in the Russian occupied area, but that's probably only 15%. They're lithium. I ran for, I guess, 6, 7 years, something called the Ukraine Business News. And so I lived and breathed mineral deposits and the problems, the barbed wire, the red tape, and trying to get them developed. They have a lot. The Europeans were coming in big time. Like in 2021, they wanted to lock in lithium reserves for electronic vehicles, EVs, batteries. I think it's a legitimate thing that can be negotiated. I personally found it a little odd that we fought the Gulf War, liberated Iraq from Saddam Hussein, and then we handed over the oil contracts, ended up going to the Brazilians, the Italians, and other people who weren't quite terribly present during the campaign. But so I think our contractual president, that turns him on. If that turns him on, great. If he's not turned on by democracy, at least he's turned on by mineral opportunities.
And sticking with Ukraine, we have a question on the military, the toll on Ukrainian military, the toll on their economy in this war. You mentioned human fatigue or war fatigue in Ukraine, but I've read too that they're running out of military soldiers. They've got people who serve multiple tours and older people as well.
Yeah, they have a interesting approach to the draft. If you remember during the Vietnam War, we were drafting kids right out of high school. I personally went through my physical at age 18. Ukrainians, have kind of an interesting philosophy. They say, well, we want these young men to reproduce and then they can join the army. We don't want them to be killed on the battlefield before they've sowed their wild oats and produced little Ukrainians. So the Ukrainian draft was sort of kicking in around age 25 or so. And I won't say it's an old man's army, but it's a experienced. There are a lot of men in their 40s, even 50s, which probably means they are more cautious, less reckless, more careful, wiser than an 18-year-old, 19-year-old. There are pluses and minuses, but there is some draft dodging, and a draft sergeant was murdered last week, and there's routinely, I think, every year, several dozen men have died trying to swim the Tuzla River into Hungary. On the other hand, they've set up a legion recruiting inside Poland for men who are working there as sort of gastarbeiters. And, I think both sides are wondering, when will this be over? There are men who've probably been serving combat roles for almost 3 years, and they're pretty much at the end of their ropes. But right now, and really since the Ukrainian failed offensive of the summer of 2023, for the last 18 months, with the exception of Kursk, the Ukrainians have been in a defensive crouch. They will not win by playing defense, but they will take huge casualties. And they claim that for every one of their guys that's killed, 7 Russians are killed. NATO says that normally, offense, defense, it's 3 attackers killed for each defender. The Ukrainians claim their ratio is a lot higher.
You talked a little bit about our new president, President Trump, and some of his statements. What kind of leverage? We have questions on the leverage that he might be able to exert over the two sides, Zelensky and Putin. He could hold back weapons delivery systems to Ukraine. What does he have that he can persuade Putin?
Well, that's very true. On the Ukrainian side, it's very simple. He can sort of pinch the garden hose and say, no more weapons, and good luck with the Europeans. And that's a legitimate threat. I think with Putin, it could be Putin could return to polite society. The sanctions could be lifted. The one way that people have underestimated Russia is how resilient they've been in getting their oil out. They have this tanker fleet. It's called a shadow tanker fleet of like 700 tankers. And they use these tankers to get their oil largely to India and Germany and China, India and China. And just parenthetically, watch this space. These tankers have no insurance. They have huge safety violations of safety regulations, and it's just a matter of time before one of these things ends up on the rocks somewhere and is polluting Copenhagen or somewhere. So expect a Exxon Valdez coming down the railroad tracks. I think, the question really is, will Trump have enough leverage with Putin? Because I think the Ukrainians have been pretty public. We are ready to talk. We're ready to negotiate. And because because Putin thinks he's winning gradually, he is not that interested in talking, at least publicly. That's what he said. But he may want to make nice with the new American administration, get sanctions lifted, sort of normalize his economy a little bit. And once again, the feeling is that Russia can get through this year, but he's going to have some tough economic sledding next year, a year from now, bankruptcies, et cetera, et cetera.
And then we have a number of questions, Jim, about actors that we haven't talked about, whether it's Iran, the German right-wing party, Elon Musk, Tulsi Gabbard, where do you see these kind of outside individual? I mean, some with greater influence than others. Has Iran pulled back totally? We heard of they
Uh,
were giving drones to.
Yeah, it's interesting. I watched the daily reports, and if you believe the Ukrainian numbers, which I think in terms of shoot downs are true, about 90% of these Iranian drones are being shot down, so they are of less use. But because the war dragged on, we definitely have this axis of autocracies, which is Russia, North Korea, Iran, and China. And it's unfortunate that we do have this alliance, but we can't ignore that it's there. Um, there's some talk that the Israelis, they seized a lot of Iranian furnished arms from Hezbollah in southern Lebanon. These were mainly Soviet Russian standard weapons, and that the Israelis might send them up to Ukraine. That has not happened as far as we know. Yeah, no, I think Iran is there, and unfortunately, they've just signed some, lifetime buddy security agreement. Um, it's very clear the Russians are more and more dependent on the Chinese, and then we've had this unique relationship with North Korea, and we don't know what the North Koreans are getting in return for sending 12,000 troops, who are probably the day rate is going to Kim Jong Un's private bank accounts. But the fear is that the Russians may be sharing nuclear secrets, ballistic missile secrets. On the materiel side, the North Koreans have become, I think they supplied half of the artillery shells used by Russia last year, and they've become a main supplier uh, of artillery pieces. So while Russia has drawn down radically its Cold War stocks, they've flailed around trying to find compatible stocks. We don't think that the Chinese have supplied conventional weapons, but we know that the North Koreans have on the Trans-Siberian Railroad. I don't know, did I answer that question?
Yeah, how about the? I mean, I don't know if there's anything there, but the new German right-wing party that.
Oh yeah, there is something there. Maybe they will sort of wake up and smell the roses. There's a lot of fear about Giorgia Meloni, the conservative right-wing premier of Italy, and she's turned out to be a sort of rabid, um, well, very pro-Zelensky, anti-Putin. And so the fears that she would go soft on Russia have not proven. The AfD, I think, has gotten Russian money in the past, Kremlin money in the past. They are a lot of they're very strong in Eastern Germany, which oddly has a certain affection for Russia, Soviet nostalgia. Um, they are forced to be dealt with or reckoned with, and the elections in Germany, I think, will be in about 2 or 3 weeks, and they may well come in as the second largest party. Um, they scored big with this vote that almost passed on closing Germany to immigrants, and I think a lot of their vote is an anti-immigrant vote. It's not necessarily a pro-Russia vote. Um, polls show that the majority of Germans want Germany to continue to send military aid to Ukraine. That poll came out just over the weekend, I think.
And then people have asked, or we have a question about you're saying that over and over again that Putin thinks he's winning, and the question is, are people not telling him, or does he not have? Does anybody around? Are they afraid of him? Are they?
Yeah, they're definitely afraid of him, and they curate, to use a modern word. They spoon feed him bad information. Putin apparently does not use computers. Sort of a weird point of pride. Um, he's surrounded by fellow former Soviet apparatchiks who have a very sort of Andropov 1975 Soviet view of the world. Um, and I mean, the fact is that they really blew it with the invasion of Ukraine, and none of the FSB, the foreign intelligence people, were fired. Um, None of the top generals really were fired. So they definitely sugarcoat what they give him, and they will blow up and magnify some town that's been bombed to smithereens, and we've taken that over. And I think he believes, and he also during COVID, his very small group of friends or advisors were these guys with kind of the Old Testament beards, sort of ultra Orthodox Russian imperialists, um, and they got his ear. And I think it's almost a point of pride to him that he is reestablishing the Russian Empire. And he's talked about Peter the Great, and he's talked about Catherine the Great, and he'd like to be remembered as Vladimir the Great.
And that brings to mind, does it serve him to just keep this going as opposed to having a peace deal and facing the personal consequences to his own power base?
John,
Much
I
like
think it does.
Netanyahu, if he
I mean, he has shifted the economy to a war economy, a military economy, um, and it's doing fairly well. It's sort of the new normal to have this military economy. Um, if he takes away this war, then he has to start answering questions. Now he can bill it. Well, we're really fighting NATO, and a lot of Russians believe this. There's this famous case. I saw it on film. As a TV reporter um, went into Kursk in August, and actually it wasn't. It was just a smartphone video, and they're talking to some locals, and the guy says, "Well, you're from America, right?" He goes, "No, I'm actually from Zhytomyr, which is like 300 miles west of here." Um, so it gives sort of a raison d'etre that we're fighting NATO, um, and they're fighting NATO supplies. But one thing I didn't mention is there has been this great big sucking sound of all the Warsaw Pact kit, MiGs, T-54 tanks, BTR, armored personnel carriers, have all been drawn into the Ukrainian conflict and are being replaced largely by American, F-35s and sort of thing. So we've benefited on that score in that we are supplying the modernization of these former Warsaw Pact countries, notably Poland, Czech, Romania, with our made in USA equipment.
and we have a number of questions about other countries in the world, and it's been disappointing that so many countries have failed to condemn this invasion, whether it's in the United Nations. A lot of them are straddling the fence, whether it's India, Brazil, South Africa. They're not, and the only countries that really are vocally opposed to this are the Western Europe, and Japan, Australia, and U.S. and Canada. What's your take on where these other countries are? I'm sure they all have their own reasons, and it's hard to generalize, but
Yeah, I think it's important to. I worked in Japan for 5 years, and Japan is sort of the mirror of Ukraine. Instead of being the Western neighbor, Japan is the Eastern neighbor. And I personally visited these islands that are under Russian control since 1945, which the Japanese continue to call their northern territories. So Japan has a real solidarity with Ukraine. They think, well, the Russian bear is attacking to the west, and next it'll turn around and attack to the east. Um, I think it's disappointing that Brazil, which the U.S. kind of helped move back from dictatorship to democracy. Um, I think the Indian leadership is basically what's good for India. And what's good for India is, frankly, buying Russian oil on the cheap and literally saving India billions of dollars. And South Africa, the people who run South Africa are the political descendants, and maybe some of them from the ANC, who were the African National Congress, who were supported and armed and trained by the Soviets in the 70s and 80s. And some of the South African leadership still can speak Russian. So they have sort of a sentimental attachment to Moscow. Um, so, it is disappointing, but countries often act on what they see as their self-interest. I'm thinking more of India. Um, and um, and their self-interest is to save billions on their oil bill.
And I think we could go on for a long time, and I don't know, I don't want to take up all of your evening, but there's a good question that might be an expansive way of kind of summing everything up. As you look at this war, and we hear from other people like our new vice president who says, this is not important. Ukraine is not our issue, it's Europe's interest. Maybe you could, how would you define the core U.S. interests in this war in Ukraine and Russia? Why is it important to us?
Yeah, I think Vice President Vance, he's well known for his positions on Ukraine, but I'm not sure he's really setting policy on Ukraine. I think that really will come from Trump. Um, the American Enterprise Institute, which is a conservative Washington think tank, came out with a report last month, estimated that if we let Putin win in Ukraine, we will have to increase our defense spending by an additional $888 billion. So there is a real dollars and cents issue that if we screw this up, if we don't stop the Russians, if we don't bolster the dike, and once again, I think no one at this point is saying that Ukrainians short term will take back the occupied areas. But if we don't stop the Russians cold now, we're going to pay 10 times more down the road for our own military budget. And that the Russians are not kidding when they would just keep going to Poland and Slovakia and create more of a mess. So we like to have a Europe that is friendly, democratic, and economically open. And so here we are. And I think we are doing a little bit on the cheap because half our aid is spent inside the United States making artillery shells in central Pennsylvania and jets and this sort of thing. One thing I think it's important to note, some people are sort of discouraged. Ukrainians have been fighting for their nationhood. I would date it back 150 years. 150 years. In 1876, Tsar Alexander II banned the Ukrainian language in the Russian Empire. And basically, for 150 years, the Ukrainians, in fits and starts, and they were independent at the end of the Bolshevik Revolution for 2 years, they've been trying to assert themselves, and it's not going to go away. And we're not going to tell the Irish that, really your interests are to be part of Great Britain and you'd be much happier part of Great Britain. And you could improve your English skills and you could benefit from rejoining Britain. It's like that train left the station. Ireland is independent. No serious person even dreams or thinks about that. The same thing with Ukraine, that Ukraine has been fighting for 150 years to be an independent democracy. And the EU is going to speed up this year the accession, joining EU. It probably happen in 2 or 3 years. So once again, that train has left the station. They don't want to be part of Russia. And what they've seen the last 3 years means they will have very difficult relations for the next, generation or two.
Well, that's a good way to sum up and give us a little morale booster towards the end of why it's important to us. Jim, I want to thank you very much
That's
for your
that's
time once again. I'll smile because this has been, again, once again, very informative and helpful. We've had a lot of questions I couldn't get to, but I tried to touch on a lot of the big themes, group them together. But you've given us a lot to think about. Certainly a lot will happen, as you say, in the next 100 days. And maybe we'll come back and tap into your resources once again later on.